I need you to take a back seat and let these officers do their duties, ma'am." The lady wearing the coral jacket, she was pointing at my dinner companion with identical lipstick that was virtually vibrating with hatred. She yelled, "I don't care who he claims to be." As they examined the identification my friend had just given them, the two police officers appeared more and more uneasy. One of them anxiously cleared his throat. "We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, Senator Harrison. There seems to be a miscommunication here." At that point in her entitled life, Dorothy Peton, the president of Silverstone Gardens HOA, committed her greatest error. "I called 911 for a reason," she added, clutching the officer's arm as she spoke, her words pouring with hate. "I'll report your badge numbers to your supervisor if you don't perform your duties. My name is Michael Fletcher. I work from home as a freelance journalist, and I chose this affluent neighborhood in Northern Virginia because it promises tranquility, the community pool, the walking trails, and the well-kept lawns. When I signed my lease, everything appeared to be ideal." The realtor neglected to disclose that Dorothy Peton, the high priestess and the person in charge of the HOA board, regarded the bylaws as sacred texts. Even in hurricane-force winds, Dorothy's immaculately combed silver hair remained in place. At the age of 62, she evidently concluded that frightening 12-year-olds wasn't satisfying enough, so she moved on to adults. The 20-block radius around Silverstone Gardens was her territory. Her favorite hobby was making neighbors' lives miserable over the tiniest infractions, and her weapon was the HOA rulebook. The event that would ultimately lead to her demise began innocently enough. James Harrison, my former roommate from college, had called to let me know he was in town for a meeting of the Judiciary Committee. I invited him over for dinner since we hadn't seen one another in 5 years. Ever since we were at Georgetown, James had done well for himself. Now serving as Pennsylvania's junior senator, he served on 3 congressional committees, including the one that deals with ethics infractions in government. I should add that throughout my brief stay at Silverstone Gardens, Dorothy had already made my life challenging. She had sent me a warning letter during my first week because my welcome mat was 2 inches larger than the permitted size. During the second week, she took a picture of my recycle bin and marked in red marker the areas where a cardboard box wasn't flattened correctly. She even claimed that my doorbell was too loud and disrupted the neighborhood's aesthetic balance. I told myself she was just a lonely retiree with too much free time, and I tried to be patient. However, I was going to discover that Dorothy Peton was not only obnoxious, but also dangerous when confronted. James's chauffeur parked in what seemed to be a typical location close to the community center. When he arrived at 7:30 that evening, it was not marked with painted marks, signage, or any other indication that it was reserved. When the doorbell rang with the forceful insistence that could only portend trouble, we were halfway through our appetizers. Dorothy appeared to be posing for a statue of righteous fury as she stood on my porch. She said, "Your guest's vehicle is in violation of HOA Statute 17.3b without even saying hello. From April through October, that location is reserved for board members." I kindly asked her where the sign indicating this was located. With a sigh, she said something that would make a kindergarten teacher pleased. Long-term inhabitants are aware of the regulations. Being ignorant is not a justification. I will have the car towed if you don't move it right away. Ever the diplomat, James got to his feet and gave his name. He offered to have the car moved immediately by his driver. However, Dorothy had already made up her mind that this was her last battle. "I don't care if you're the Pope himself," she muttered, glancing him up and down with contempt. Regulations are regulations. What transpired next still makes me furious. Dorothy took out her phone and began photographing James, focusing on his face, his attire, and even his shoes. She said, "This is what we're dealing with," loud enough for neighbors to hear as she passed. "Outsiders who believe they are superior to the norms of our community. I knew you'd be trouble when I saw you moving in with all those boxes of books," she snarled, turning to face me with a scowl that could make milk curdle. Intellectuals always believe they are unique. Before we could react, she bounded off. 2 police cruisers with flashing lights arrived 20 minutes later. As Dorothy stood in my driveway, with her arms crossed and told the authorities that she had seen strange activity and possibly criminal trespassing, the entire neighborhood turned out to observe In fact, she had informed dispatch that two males were having a boisterous party and would not leave when asked by worried locals. Naturally, she was the only resident who was worried. The officers made a cautious yet professional approach to us. They had been informed that a man wearing a pricey suit was threatening people and refusing to leave private property. James maintained his composure when presenting his driver's card and Senate identity badge. The first officer's entire attitude shifted the instant he used his phone to scan the badge. "I'm really sorry, Senator Harrison. We were provided with inaccurate information regarding the circumstances." The officer turned to face Dorothy, his frustration scarcely disguised. "You reported a sitting U.S. Senator as suspicious by calling 911, ma'am." In a split second, Dorothy's expression changed from victorious to defensive. She babbled on the sanctity of HOA governance, as well as rules and processes. She made her deadly mistake at that point, shouting that she was going to expose police, corruption, and favoritism. She took out her phone and began recording. She said, "You're all in on it together. The government believes it has the ability to scare private citizens." James took out his personal phone and placed a silent call. His chief of staff was on speaker and taking notes regarding the incident in a matter of minutes. Although Dorothy was unaware of it at the time, she had just set off an official investigation that would bring down her tiny kingdom. The following 48 hours flew by. Dorothy had phoned the police on residents 17 times in the previous year alone. James' team found out all of the calls were for minor offenses that didn't call for the cops to become involved. Numerous residents complained of unfair enforcement, namely targeting renters as opposed to owners, according to their findings. She was accused of embezzling HOA money for her own landscaping. According to the investigation, she had been leveraging her position to offer her nephew's lawn care business contracts at exorbitant prices. On Thursday evening, an emergency HOA meeting was scheduled. Residents who had endured Dorothy's reign of terror were crammed into the community center. James' story was heartbreaking, and he participated via video conference. He clarified that the federal government was concerned about the abuse of emergency services for HOA issues, particularly when it seemed to indicate discriminatory and harassing trends. Dorothy attempted to defend herself by saying that she was only upholding the regulations that maintained high property values. However, one person after another came forward with their own terrifying tales. The elderly woman was fined $500 for leaving her trash cans out in the open for an additional hour. She had threatened to use liens against the young couple for putting up a little bird feeder. She had tormented the injured veteran. Regarding his assistant's dog, the board demanded a vote of no confidence right away. Only Dorothy and two allies favored her remaining president, and she was ousted by a vote of 97-3. However, that was only the start of her issues. Dorothy had been involved in a side project with the towing company, according to the probe. She received a $50 kickback under the table for each vehicle she towed. She had kept close to $8,000 in these unlawful commissions over the course of 3 years. She had also been adding an additional $1,200 to her illicit income by charging residents for copies of HOA paperwork that ought to have been provided for free. The finding of her covert recordings, however, was possibly the most detrimental. During complaint sessions, Dorothy had been secretly recording residents and used the recordings to coerce them into resolving their complaints. If a resident, a nurse called Patricia, didn't withdraw her petition to change the parking regulations, her complaints about loud music would be used against her in a child custody dispute. An investigation into the claims of embezzlement was launched by the State Attorney General's office. There was overwhelming proof. Over the course of 3 years, Dorothy had misappropriated about $40,000 in HOA funds. Additionally, she had submitted fraudulent police reports, a crime that carries a jail sentence. 3 months later, Dorothy Peton saw the judge read her sentence while she stood in a courtroom. She was placed on 2 years of probation for embezzlement and mandated to make $41,300 in full restitution. She was placed under home arrest with an ankle monitor for 6 months for making false police reports. She was also barred by the judge from ever holding a position on any HOA board in the state. Dorothy's flawless poise eventually broke as the gavel descended. As the bailiff described the conditions of her home detention, she broke down in tears. After frightening a whole neighborhood over parking spaces and bird feeders, the woman was now confined to her own house, and watched from her window as the neighborhood threw a block party to celebrate her collapse, which she was not permitted to join.